The moment I walked into that conference room, my son's wife looked up from her stack of papers and smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I'd seen that smile before. 31 years of sitting on the federal bench will teach you to read a room, and what I read in that room on that Tuesday morning in late October was that Serena believed she had already won. She was wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where this really started, because it didn't start in that conference room. It started on a Sunday in August over pot roast. My son Colin had always been a good boy. I don't say that the way mothers say it to excuse things. I say it because it was genuinely true, and because understanding that matters for understanding everything that came after. He was thoughtful. He called every Sunday. He remembered my birthday without a reminder. After his father passed 6 years ago now, Colin drove 4 hours each way every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, never complained once. He was, in the most real sense, a good son. Serena came into his life about 3 years ago. She was a financial planner, polished and precise, with a habit of tilting her head slightly when she listened to you, the way people do when they've been trained to appear attentive. Colin was completely taken with her. I tried to be happy for him. I was happy for him mostly. She just made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up in a way I couldn't immediately explain. I'm retired now. I live in a small house outside of Asheville, North Carolina, with 2 cats and more books than I have shelves for. I keep a garden. I drive to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. To anyone looking from the outside, I am a perfectly ordinary woman in her late 60s who has settled into a quiet life. That is more or less what I want people to see. What most people don't know, what I've never felt the need to advertise, is that I spent 31 years as a federal judge in the Western District of North Carolina. I presided over hundreds of civil cases involving fraud, financial misconduct, estate disputes, and asset concealment. I've seen every variation of money disappearing from people who trusted the wrong person. I know the playbook. I helped write the case law on parts of it. I retired quietly. I didn't do interviews. I didn't write a memoir. I moved to my house in the hills, and I let people assume I'd been a school teacher or maybe a librarian, and that suited me perfectly fine. Serena knew I'd been a judge. Colin had told her that much. What she apparently didn't know or didn't take seriously was exactly what kind of judge I had been. That distinction would matter enormously later. The pot roast Sunday in August was when I first noticed something specific, something beyond the general unease I always felt around Serena. Colin and she had driven up for the weekend, which was unusual. They normally came only for holidays. Over dinner, Serena mentioned very casually that she had been helping me, organizing my finances, she said, making sure everything was in order. She said it the way you'd say you'd watered someone's plants while they were out of town. I set down my fork. "I'm sorry," I said. Colin jumped in quickly. He'd been doing that lately, jumping in when Serena said things that landed oddly. "She just means she's been looking things over, Mum. We were worried. You mentioned last spring that you'd been forgetting appointments." I had mentioned that, once, as a passing comment about how my calendar app and I had a complicated relationship. I had not mentioned it as a cry for help. "I appreciate the concern," I said, keeping my voice even. "But my finances are in order. I've managed them for 40 years without assistance." Serena smiled. That smile. "Of course," she said. "We just care about you." After dinner, while Colin helped me with the dishes, he told me gently that Serena had suggested I might want to think about a power of attorney arrangement. Just for peace of mind, he said, in case something happened. He said it with such earnest worry on his face that I didn't say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was, someone has been coaching him on how to have this conversation. "I'll think about it," I told him. I didn't sleep much that night. The following week, I called my old law clerk, a sharp young man named Patrick, who now ran a small firm in Charlotte. I asked him a simple question. Had anyone made any inquiries regarding my estate, my assets, or any accounts associated with my name? He called me back the next day. His voice was careful in the way that meant he had something to tell me that he wasn't sure how to say. There had been an inquiry. A financial planning firm, Serena's firm, had pulled what's called a soft inquiry on a joint account I had with Colin, one we'd set up years ago for family emergencies. It held a small amount, not significant on its own. But someone had been looking at it, and when Patrick dug a little further at my request, we found that the signature on a form requesting account information matched a notarized document that had my name on it. I had not signed that document. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call. One of my cats, the grey one, came and sat on the table and looked at me with that particular feline expression that seems to say, "So, what are we going to do about it?" "We're going to be patient," I told him. And that's what I did. I was patient. I did not call Colin. I did not confront Serena. I did not change any accounts, did not alert the bank, did nothing that would signal that I knew anything was happening, because I had spent 3 decades watching prosecutors make the mistake of moving too early, tipping their hand before the picture was complete. The only way to build something airtight was to let it build. Over the next 6 weeks, I paid very careful attention. I noticed that Serena had started calling me more often, short, warm calls, just checking in, asking how I was feeling. Was I sleeping well? Had I been to my doctor recently? The questions had a rhythm to them, the same rhythm I recognized from cases involving what the law calls undue influence. You establish dependency, you document perceived vulnerability, you create a record. She was creating a record. I also noticed that the calls always ended with some small mention of the future. My house, which had appreciated considerably since I'd bought it 20 years ago. My retirement accounts. "You must feel so secure knowing you've taken such good care of yourself," she said once, and the words were perfectly pleasant and made my skin crawl. Colin, during this time, seemed distracted and a little guilty whenever we spoke. I knew that look. When he was 12, he'd broken a neighbour's window with a baseball and tried to hide it for 2 weeks before confessing. He had the same quality of not quite meeting my eyes now. He wasn't malicious. He was convinced. That was the saddest part, if I'm honest, watching my son look at me and see what someone else had taught him to see. I flew to Charlotte in September under the pretext of visiting a friend, which was also genuinely true. I did visit my friend Cecilia, who teaches philosophy at Davidson and makes excellent bourbon chicken. While I was in Charlotte, I also met with Patrick and 2 colleagues of his who specialized in financial fraud and elder law. We went through everything I had gathered quietly over the previous weeks. The forged inquiry form, records showing that a second document, this one related to a small investment account, had also been accessed using my name, a pattern of contact from Serena's firm that had no legitimate basis. One of Patrick's colleagues, a woman who had been doing elder financial abuse cases for 20 years, looked up from the documents and said, "She's done this before." That was the moment I felt the full weight of it. Not anger exactly, though there was anger. Something heavier. The knowledge that my son had been placed next to someone who selected him, at least in part because his mother was an elderly woman who appeared to be alone and comfortable and forgettable. They forgot to check what kind of judge I'd been. We filed a formal complaint with the North Carolina State Bar and the relevant Financial Regulatory Board in early October. We also filed a civil complaint. The process required a mediation session before any court hearing. This was standard in civil financial disputes. That mediation was scheduled for the last Tuesday of October. Serena's attorney, a man named Whitfield, who had the expensive suit and the slightly too confident posture of someone accustomed to outmaneuvering people who don't know the rules, had clearly advised her to come to mediation to negotiate, expecting that I would want to settle quietly. Elderly woman, he probably reasoned, doesn't want the stress of a prolonged proceeding, will accept an arrangement and be glad it's over. I drove to Charlotte the night before and stayed at Cecilia's. We had bourbon chicken again. She knew what was happening and she knew me well enough not to make a big speech about it. She just poured me another glass and said, "Go get them, Vivian." That's my name, Vivian Hartley. I should have mentioned that sooner. I walked into the conference room at 9 in the morning wearing a navy blazer and the reading glasses I've had for 15 years, the ones Colin always teased me about because they're slightly crooked on one side. Patrick walked in beside me. Across the table sat Serena, composed as ever, and Whitfield, who glanced up from his folder with the patient, slightly patronizing expression of a man who expects this to be brief. Colin was there too. He sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded, not looking at me. My chest hurt when I saw him, not from anger, from the specific grief of watching someone you love be confused about who you are. The mediator introduced himself. Whitfield began talking. He spoke about my age, 67, he said, as if this were a medical diagnosis. He spoke about my diminishing capacity for financial oversight, citing the appointment I'd mentioned forgetting 8 months ago. He was building the picture Serena had been constructing, a woman who needed managing. I let him talk. Patrick let him talk. We had agreed on this. You let a man show you his whole hand before you play yours. When Whitfield finally paused, the mediator looked at my side of the table. I took off my crooked glasses and set them down. I said, calmly, that before we proceeded, I wanted to enter into the record my professional background, as it was directly relevant to evaluating the claims being made. I said I had served as a United States federal judge in the Western District of North Carolina for 31 years, that among the case categories in which I developed specific expertise was financial fraud and the legal mechanisms used to conceal unauthorized asset access. That I was, in fact, the authoring judge on 2 circuit-level opinions that established the evidentiary standards currently used in exactly this category of elder financial abuse case in this state. The room was quiet. Whitfield had stopped writing. The mediator, a retired attorney himself, older than Whitfield, looked up from his notes and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said slowly, "Judge Hartley." "Retired," I said, "but yes." He sat back in his chair. He looked at Whitfield. Then he looked at Serena. Serena, for the first time since I had known her, looked uncertain. I watched the calculation happen behind Whitfield's eyes. He was realizing in real time that the woman he had prepared to walk over had written the rule book he would have to argue against. He was realizing that every document Serena had produced, every inference about my capacity, every carefully assembled record of my supposed fragility, was about to be reviewed by the person who knew exactly what was real and what was manufactured. I turned to my son. He was looking at me now, really looking at me, for what felt like the first time in months. His face had gone through several things very quickly, and had landed somewhere I can only describe as wrecked. "I didn't know," he said. It wasn't loud. It was barely above a whisper. "I know you didn't," I said. That was the only exchange we had in that room about what had happened between us. The rest of the session was procedural. Whitfield requested a recess almost immediately. When they came back, the posture had shifted entirely. Serena's attorney was no longer outlining terms. He was listening. We didn't settle that day. The process took another 6 weeks, through regulatory proceedings and a civil action that Patrick handled with the kind of quiet precision that makes me glad I once had the good judgment to hire him. What emerged from those proceedings was not something I'll describe in full detail here, but I will say the forged documents were confirmed. The pattern of access was documented across 3 other clients of Serena's firm. I was not the only one, as Patrick's colleague had suspected, and Serena surrendered her license and reached a financial settlement that included full restitution to every client affected. She also lost her marriage because my son, when he finally understood the complete picture, filed for divorce in November. I did not encourage that. I told him it was his decision. He told me he needed to make it. The hardest conversation I had through all of this wasn't in a conference room or a courtroom. It was at my kitchen table in December, when Colin drove up unannounced on a Saturday and stood at my front door in the cold with his hands in his pockets and didn't say anything for a moment. I opened the door wider and said, "There's coffee." He came in and sat at the table where I'd sat with my cat 6 months earlier, figuring out what to do. He wrapped both hands around a mug and he said, "I keep thinking about all the times she asked me about your memory, whether you seemed off." And I answered her. I didn't even think about why she was asking. "She was good at it," I said. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "I had a feeling," I said. "I didn't know the specifics until I looked." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it." "You weren't supposed to see it," I told him. "That was the whole point of it. You were supposed to see what she showed you. And what she showed you was someone who loved you and was worried about your mother." I set down my own coffee. She wasn't entirely wrong that she was worried about your mother. She just didn't account for what your mother actually was. He laughed a little at that, which was the first time I'd heard him laugh in months. It loosened something in my chest that had been tight for a long time. He stayed for dinner. We ordered pizza because neither of us felt like cooking, and we watched something forgettable on television. And he fell asleep on my couch, and I let him. And in the morning I made eggs, and we sat and talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular, and everything that mattered. That was the part they never show you in the version of this story where it's just about winning. The winning part was almost beside the point. The part that mattered was that my son looked at me across a kitchen table and saw me clearly again. Not the woman he'd been coached to see, diminished, uncertain, in need of managing. Just his mother, the person who had been here all along. I've thought about what I would say to other women in their 60s who might recognize something in this story, something in that particular pattern of small questions. Are you eating enough? Are you sleeping well? Are you sure you remember that are designed to make you feel smaller than you are? Here is what I know. Age is not the vulnerability they think it is. The grey hair and the crooked reading glasses and the quiet life in the hills. None of it diminishes what you know. None of it erases what you built. The people who look at a woman over 60 and see an easy mark are making a very old and very consistent mistake. They forget to ask what you did before you got quiet. I got quiet on purpose. I built my garden, and I read my books, and I let the world think whatever it wanted to think. But I never stopped being who I am. You don't stop being who you are. You just wait for the moment it becomes necessary to remember out loud. In that conference room, when I said my name and my title and watched the certainty drain out of Whitfield's face, I wasn't doing it for satisfaction. I mean, there was some satisfaction. I'm human. But mostly, I was doing it because 31 years on the bench had taught me that the truth has a particular kind of weight. And when you set it down on a table in front of people who've been trafficking in something else, the whole room shifts. The whole room shifted. And then, slowly, everything else did too. I keep coming back to that moment at my kitchen table in December, when Colin wrapped both hands around a coffee mug and couldn't quite look at me. And I thought about how much of life comes down to exactly that, the gap between what we allow people to believe about us and what we actually are. Serena made a calculation. She looked at a woman in her late 60s with crooked reading glasses and a quiet house and a garden, and she decided that was the whole picture. And the truth is, I'd spent years curating that picture deliberately. I stepped off the bench and I stepped back from the noise of it, and I let the world file me away. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions. I didn't need to. What she didn't understand, what people like her rarely understand, is that the things you've built don't disappear when you stop advertising them. The knowledge doesn't drain out. The judgment doesn't dull. You carry 31 years of understanding how fraud works, how manipulation works, how the quiet and methodical dismantling of someone's autonomy works, and you carry it just as clearly at 67 as you did at 40. The only difference is that by 67 you also know exactly how to be still. You know how to watch without reacting. You know how to let someone reveal the full shape of what they're doing before you respond to any of it. That patience, the discipline of not moving too soon, that came from integrity, from years of being responsible for outcomes that affected real people's lives. When you've held that kind of responsibility, you don't take shortcuts, you don't react out of pride or anger. You wait until you have what you need and then you act on what's true rather than what's convenient. The intelligence piece was the part Serena genuinely underestimated. She knew I'd been a judge. She just didn't know what kind, and she didn't look hard enough to find out. That was her real mistake, not malice, not greed alone, but in curiosity. She didn't ask enough questions. I've seen that pattern more times than I can count. People who are skilled at working a specific system begin to believe that skill is the same as wisdom. It isn't. Wisdom requires that you keep questioning what you don't know yet, and she had stopped doing that. And then there's what I'd call the harder part, the part that wasn't about winning at all. Sitting across from my son in that mediation room and understanding that his confusion wasn't weakness, it was love that had been steered. He had wanted to care for me. Someone handed him a version of me that needed caring for, and he accepted it because it came wrapped in something that looked like concern. That required something from me beyond preparation and knowledge. It required me to stay open to him even while I was protecting myself from what was being done. To hold both things simultaneously, this has to stop, and he is not the enemy. That's the part nobody tells you about when they talk about standing up for yourself. It costs something to protect someone while also forgiving them for not seeing you clearly. It's a kind of endurance that doesn't make it into the headlines. Colin asked me once, a few months later, how I wasn't angrier. I told him the truth. I was angry. I just didn't let the anger make the decisions. The anger told me something was wrong. Everything I'd built over a lifetime told me what to do about it. That's the only formula I know. Pay attention. Don't move until you understand the whole shape of a thing, and never ever let someone else's limited version of you become the version you believe.